Let's take an early look at the Midair near Winter Haven, Florida. The Midair involved a J-3 Cub operating out of Jack Brown Seaplane Base and a Piper PA-28-161, a Warrior, operating out of Lakeland, Florida from Polk State College. The Warrior flew over from Lakeland to Winter Haven and was accomplishing multiple approaches. There was an instructor on board the Warrior and a student, and an instructor on board the J-3 and a student as well. As the Warrior is doing multiple approaches to runway 29 at Winter Haven, the J-3 is returning down Lake Hartridge and then will proceed via a canal into Lake Idlewild and then up to Lake Jessie. Based on traffic calls from the Warrior, we know the Warrior was in a pattern for runway 29, a typical left-hand pattern, and doing what the instructor called short approaches. They had done multiple of these approaches. Meanwhile, the J-3 has no radio or no ADSB equipment, nor is it required to in that area. We know from grainy video footage that the two airplanes collided just after the Warrior turned from downwind to base. The Warrior pilot made a call for base, and then we can hear the ELT over the radio.
Traffic 21 Delta is turning left base for runway 29 Winter Haven.
The collision happened, it appears, with the Warrior in a left-hand descending turn as the two airplanes collide. The NTSB issued a statement that, based on the video footage they obtained, they can confirm the two airplanes collided nearly head-on. They also stated that the J-3 attempted to dive to the right immediately before the collision. All four aboard, the two people in the J-3 and the two people in the Warrior, both died. So what are the factors that led to the Midair and the collision? First, let's look at the conditions. VFR conditions, with wind out of the west at about 10 knots, which meant operations were optimum on runway 29 at Winter Haven. The calm, no-wind runway at Winter Haven is runway 5, and that's the longer runway. Visibility was at least 10 miles, and there was a light scattered deck at around 4,000 feet, so optimum conditions. But also we know that most midairs happen near the traffic pattern and within VFR conditions. The sun could have been a factor. Looking at the estimated flight paths, we know the flight path of the Warrior, it had ADSB. The J-3 did not, but based on conversations with people in the area and who were familiar with the flight that day and the profile of the J-3, it looks like the J-3 was heading inbound over Lake Hartridge and down at a lower altitude. It would have been facing towards the sun, not staring directly into it, but the sun may have been a distraction for them. And looking up into a sun-bleached sky for a white airplane can be difficult to spot. So the conditions were really optimum for this kind of flying, but perhaps sun angle was an issue. Let's look at equipment. The Warrior, coming from Polk State, had radios and ADSB out at least. The J-3, meanwhile, had neither, and that may have been a factor in this mishap. The J-3 coming inbound would have had no situational awareness, either from radio or from ADSB in. Now, to be clear, this is typical for Jack Brown seaplane operations, and they've been operating for more than 60 years this way. They've done that by using procedures that usually keep them clear of traffic from Winter Haven. Obviously, on this day, that broke down. So let's take a look at what we know about those procedures from Jack Brown Seaplane Base that may have been a factor in the mishap. We know that from talking to people who've flown at Jack Brown's that they'll roll their altimeter down to 0 when they're on the water as they depart. The field elevation for Winter Haven is 146 feet. So that's a difference in 150 feet or so based on what airplanes are reading off their altimeter and the accuracy of that from aircraft that are in the pattern at Winter Haven and aircraft that are operating off the water at Jack Brown's seaplane base. The way that Jack Brown's deconflicts from traffic at Winter Haven is, the Winter Haven traffic will fly at 1,000 MSL, which is basically about 850 feet AGL. Jack Brown's airplanes will stay below 500 feet AGL based on their altimeter setting. Usually that deconfliction is staying low, and for 60 years it's kept them fine without any kind of traffic problems. But on today, as so often happens with accidents, conditions were just right, where some factors seem to have come together that may have contributed to the mishap. Based on people we talked to familiar with the operations that day, the J-3 was likely headed south to southwest bound over Lake Hartridge as it came in to set up for a right base to fly over Lake Idlewild and land to the north on Lake Jessie. Meanwhile, the Warrior's on left downwind, flying close approaches. As it gets just past the touchdown point, it begins its left turn and establishes a solid descent to get around a base and then established on final. Somewhere in that turn, just after the Warrior calls left base, the collision occurs. So if we put ourselves in the cockpit of the Warrior, an instructor and a student flying short approaches, they're likely looking over their left shoulder at the runway behind them, trying to gauge the altitude in their descent to make the short approach. As they begin that turn, they establish the bank and collide with a J-3 that's heading towards them. Meanwhile, the J-3 is coming inbound and setting up their visual approach. Flying southbound over Lake Hartridge, the procedure is they find the canal at the southwest part of the lake, fly that over to Lake Idlewild, and then set up for their final approach. So their eyes are likely down and to the right as they're looking to establish the water in the bank. Meanwhile, the Cherokee is coming high out of a sun-bleached sky, and because it's on a collision path, it's stationary on their windscreen. Our eyes are optimized to see movement, and unfortunately, objects we're going to collide with will show no movement on our windscreen and therefore won't get our attention. So if they were looking down and to the right, trying to establish their pattern and their base, they wouldn't have seen the Warrior coming out of a sun-bleached sky, stationary on their windscreen, unless they were looking for it. So what are the lessons learned that we can take away from this mishap? First is to realize, again, most mid-airs happen near an airport and near the traffic pattern, as this one did. Second, Winter Haven Airport has become a busy airport. People we talk to that fly out of there have seen the activity levels increase year after year. Maybe it's time for both the Winter Haven Airport officials and Jack Brown Seaplane Base to get together and review their procedures to make sure they're still appropriate. They can consider whether setting an altimeter on the water to 0 and having a difference of 150 feet or so between airplanes right above you flying in the pattern still makes sense. It could also perhaps be time to consider some ADS-B-N technology for the J-3s operating out of Jack Brown Seaplane Base, so at least the instructors and the pilots have more situational awareness as they operate in and out of the seaplane base for the level of traffic and the position of traffic off of Winter Haven. The mid-air is a tragedy. It happened, as it so often does with mid-airs, where things just happen to line up perfectly for two airplanes to be in the same piece of sky, and it cost 4 lives. We'll look for the preliminary report from the NTSB, and we'll keep you posted on this channel and in the comments. Thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting AOPA.